The Washington Wizards had one of the biggest free agents on the market this summer in Bradley Beal, and they managed to re-sign him, which you would think means they had a successful offseason. But it isn't truly that clear-cut. So let's dive into the Bradley Beal contract, what it truly means for the future of the Wizards, and why I think they now have the worst future in the NBA. Bradley Beal re-signed. The Wizards managed to retain their all-star shooting guard, but it came at quite the price. Beal will be making over $250 million through the next 5 seasons, with the 5th year having a player option, with a no-trade clause, with a 15% trade kicker. This man didn't just get a supermax. He got the keys to the mansion, a yacht, and his own private island with the amount of add-ins that were in this contract. And for someone who is arguably one of the worst supermax contract players in the NBA, he isn't exactly the player that you thought would get these add-ons and get one of the most generous contracts in NBA history, not just from the monetary value standpoint, but from the perspective of the added bonuses. To put it into perspective how massive this contract is, Beal is now the only active player with a no-trade clause in the NBA, and only the 10th in NBA history. And yes, that's to say that not even LeBron James, or Steph Curry, or Giannis, or the newly signed extension by Nikola Jokic, none of those deals have a no-trade clause in them. Yet Bradley Beal does. And the 10 players in NBA history who have had a no-trade clause at some point in time in their career are all significantly better players than Bradley Beal. Those players being LeBron James, Kevin Garnett, Carmelo Anthony, Kobe Bryant, Dirk Nowitzki, Dwayne Wade, Tim Duncan, David Robinson, and John Stockton. All Hall of Fame caliber players, and all significantly better than Bradley Beal in their primes. Now, there is nothing wrong with paying Bradley Beal. In a vacuum, in an isolated incident, paying Bradley Beal a supermax contract in the right situation, even at this large sum of money, is not a bad decision. But you have to be a competitive team that is pushing for a title, and Bradley Beal has to be one of your secondary options alongside your superstar. But of course, that is not the case in Washington. Washington are currently not a title contender. Bradley Beal is not playing alongside a superstar as a secondary option. He is the primary option, playing alongside Kristaps Porzingis. And that situation is what plays a big part in why the Wizards are not that great of a team, and in turn is what makes this contract so bad. But let's go bigger than why this contract isn't great. Because this contract alone is not the only reason why the Wizards are currently set up for failure. In the NBA, to be successful at some point in time, whether it be now or down the road, you need to pick a direction. Option number 1 is being an NBA title contender, or at the very least being a consistent playoff team that can get to the second round with some amount of regularity. Option number 2 is to rebuild, acquire young talent and draft capital, and build towards the future until you can be that team that can strive to make a deep playoff run every year. The perfect example of this that can show both options is Utah. Utah thought that they had a team that could be an NBA title contender, that could be a regular second round team, conference finals team, and they ran it for a few years with Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, and once they realized that they didn't quite have an NBA title contending team, that they were going to be stuck in the middle, they chose a direction. They've traded away Rudy Gobert and are now listening to offers for Donovan Mitchell. Because you have to pick a direction to have success in the NBA. Now, there is a third option as to how you can build your team, but it's not really a viable option for success. This third option is to be mediocre, to be a fringe playoff team, to be what Utah would have been if they continued to run it back with Rudy and Donovan Mitchell. But they didn't. They chose a direction, as they should. Essentially, you need to either be good enough to compete, or you need to be bad enough to be one of the worst teams in the league to get high-end draft selections. Another example of a team that was in the middle is the Indiana Pacers before trading away Domantas Sabonis and Malcolm Brogdon. They were regularly in and around the bottom of the playoff picture with no upside to be anything more than that, but were always good enough to be at worst a back-end lottery team, leaving them in the middle with no way to go up or down, specifically as a small market that would struggle to attract any big-name free agents. Well, as far as that team now in the East that sits in the middle, it's clearly, as far as I'm concerned, the Washington Wizards. The Wizards are currently a fringe play-in team at best when healthy, but in my opinion, are certainly not bad enough to be a tanking team thanks to Bradley Beal, Kristaps Porzingis, Kyle Kuzma, and others. So let's dive deep into why the Wizards are a fringe play-in team with no upside and currently sit in the worst place in the NBA, mediocrity. The Washington Wizards have done everything right over the last 8 months to confirm themselves as a very average team with little upside, starting with the acquisition of Kristaps Porzingis. As an isolated trade, it made sense. Spencer Dinwiddie was struggling in Washington and Davis Bertans was struggling to find his three-point shot while on a big contract, and Kristaps Porzingis was at his lowest value ever, while on a big contract, while struggling to fit in Dallas alongside Luka. But in the big picture, it didn't make sense. Obviously, acquiring Kristaps Porzingis is not a trade that pushes the direction of any organization towards a rebuild. So the Wizards made the move with trying to be a competitive roster in mind. But how does that really work in reality? And how competitive could this roster actually be? I mean, Kristaps Porzingis and Luka Doncic was a duo that didn't work together and ultimately had very limited success, specifically all first-round exits. And once Kristaps Porzingis left, not that it was fully because Porzingis was gone, but once he did leave, they made a conference finals. So what would make anyone think that the duo of Kristaps Porzingis and Bradley Beal would have any significant success if Luka and Kristaps Porzingis couldn't? Beal is a significantly worse playmaker than Doncic, he's a weaker scorer, and is just simply put a less impactful player. He is not anywhere near as good as Luka, which is no knock to Beal because Luka is emerging as a borderline top 5 player in the NBA. But if Luka and KP can't have great success, then how will Beal and KP have great success? That being said, Beal and KP are a solid duo and not one that will nosedive towards being a bad team, but there is no chance that that duo does anything more than make the play-in tournament. But the Wizards didn't stop there. They continued with the commitment to being mediocre this offseason, starting with the behemoth contract for Bradley Beal that was previously mentioned. Locking in Bradley Beal and in turn locking yourself into having someone that can carry your team to at the very least not be a rebuilding team for the next 5 years. Leaving the Wizards without the opportunity to pick a direction. Leaving the Wizards without the opportunity to have a true rebuild with many high first-round pick selections. And they even made a trade to address their needs to try and be a slightly more competitive roster. Slightly less likely to be able to rebuild by acquiring Monte Morris and Will Barton in exchange for KCP. Now, KCP was certainly a valuable loss, but the Wizards had fairly significant depth at the forward position from Rui to Kuzma to Denny Avdija and Corey Kispert. Monte Morris fills a severe need at point guard that has been needed to be filled since Dinwiddie was traded at the deadline, and Will Barton will fill some shooting guard minutes while Bradley Beal and Johnny Davis will round out that backcourt. In turn, they significantly improved the weakest part of the roster and further help the Wizards to be an average team, but do not move the needle anywhere near enough to make the Wizards a consistent playoff team in the East. So with it seeming clear the Wizards are currently set on being mediocre, but seemingly no direction towards any bit of upside, what options do they have to actually attain some level of upside and work towards a brighter future? Well, in an ideal situation, the best plan is to be able to trade Bradley Beal away for a young player and a bunch of first-round picks, move on from other veterans for future assets, with some of those vets being moved, being Kyle Kuzma, Monte Morris, and Will Barton amongst others, and work towards a rebuild. But that ideal situation might not be available anymore. Over the last few years, we have seen some big contracts get traded, even contracts that many consider to be untradeable, such as John Wall and Russell Westbrook. But they have been traded. However, the exception to that is that those untradeable contracts were only able to be traded for each other. The Bradley Beal contract might not be as bad as the John Wall and Russell Westbrook contracts, but it is for significantly more money on an annual rate. And at the very least, it is very unlikely the Wizards trade Bradley Beal and at this current contract get a package of young players and first-round picks that spring them towards an amazing rebuild. Something they could have done last offseason before the trade deadline of the 2021 season or that year's previous offseason. So the scenario in which the Wizards trade away Beal and push towards a rebuild was a great option before his injury and now before his new contract. Under this current contract, his trade value has changed drastically, and at best, you'll likely get matching expiring contracts for him with potentially some additional future assets, but that's probably your best case scenario, and you're certainly not getting anywhere near as valuable a package as you would have 12, 18, or 24 months ago that would have spurred you into a brilliant rebuild. So where does that leave the Wizards? Well, unfortunately, it probably leaves them running it back with Beal and whatever players they surround him with for the next 3, 4, or 5 years. Ultimately, as long as Bradley Beal continues to stay in Washington, be happy there, and continues to pick up his paycheck, which, given the fact that he was willing to re-sign this extension, never ask for a trade, and not end up signing elsewhere, he's probably going to do, and is just going to continue to hang out in Washington. It leaves them in a place where they are around a 35 to 42 win team, depending on the year, that will fight for the play-in tournament, but doesn't really have any more upside than that. The Wizards had a perfect chance to move on from Bradley Beal over the last 2 seasons, cash in on his value, acquire future assets, and pick a direction to begin having some upside, to begin having a chance to build a competitive roster that can do more than just be a fringe play-in team. But instead, they committed to keeping Bradley Beal around, and in turn, they have limited their options and their upside drastically, and in my opinion, are currently the team in the NBA with the worst future, with no clear way for this roster to be great, and no clear way to start a rebuild.